In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council chambers, where the most brilliant minds from 1,000 worlds gathered to debate the fate of civilizations, one species was consistently overlooked. Humans, those strange, short-lived creatures from a small blue planet on the outer rim. They had no advanced technology like the Xantharians, no psychic abilities like the Vorthack, no centuries of accumulated wisdom like the Elder Council of Proxima. But what they did have was something far more dangerous than any weapon, more unpredictable than any quantum storm, and more terrifying than the void of space itself. The audacity to never know when they were beaten. Today, that audacity would shatter the confidence of the galaxy's most renowned intellect, leaving her speechless for the first time in her 3-century career. What she thought would be a simple demonstration of human inferiority would become a legend whispered across star systems. A reminder that sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unexpected sources. This is the story of how a human dared to challenge the impossible, and in doing so, changed everything. The crystalline spires of the Galactic Council Station gleamed against the backdrop of distant nebulae, their surfaces reflecting the light of 3 different suns. Within the Grand Assembly Hall, representatives from across the known galaxy had gathered for what was supposed to be a routine session on trade regulations. The air hummed with a dozen different atmospheric compositions, carefully maintained by the station's sophisticated life support systems. Dr. Zalara Nexthes stood at the central podium, her 6 arms gracefully gesturing as she addressed the assembly. Her species, the Colonians, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their intellectual prowess. With their elongated skulls containing brains 3 times the size of most sentient species, they've been the undisputed masters of scientific advancement for over 2 millennia. Zalara herself was perhaps the most celebrated among them. Holder of 17 advanced degrees from the prestigious Academy of Cosmic Sciences, author of the definitive texts on quantum mechanics and dimensional theory, and the youngest being ever to receive the Galactic Medal of Intellectual Excellence. Today, she was presenting her latest research on cognitive limitations among the various species of the galaxy. Her voice carried the authority of absolute certainty as she displayed holographic charts showing intelligence metrics across different worlds. As you can see from these comprehensive studies, Zalara continued, her primary hands manipulating the data while her secondary arms gestured for emphasis, there exists a clear hierarchy of intellectual capability among sentient species. The Colonians naturally represent the apex of cognitive evolution, followed by the Synthoids with their quantum-enhanced processors, then the Vorthack with their collective consciousness abilities. The holographic display shifted to show a 3-dimensional graph with various species plotted according to their measured intelligence quotients. Near the bottom of the chart, a small blue dot barely registered on the scale. And here, Zalara said with what could only be described as academic condescension, we find the humans of Earth. Despite their recent admission to the Galactic Council, their cognitive abilities remain remarkably limited. Their brains, constrained by biological evolution on a single world, show significant deficiencies in logical processing, mathematical computation, and strategic thinking. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some delegates nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their specially designed seats. The human delegation sat in their assigned section, a small group of 5 individuals who seemed almost insignificant compared to the towering Colonians or the ethereal energy beings of the Luminous Collective. Ambassador Sarek Chun, the lead human representative, maintained her composure despite the obvious slight. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life filled with both joy and responsibility. Her simple black diplomatic attire stood in stark contrast to the elaborate robes and biomechanical enhancements worn by other delegates. Beside her sat Dr. Marcus Webb, Earth's chief scientific advisor, Colonel Lisa Rodriguez, military liaison, Engineer Thomas Park, and Dr. Amara Okafor, a specialist in xenocultural relations. Furthermore, Zalara continued, now warming to her subject, humans exhibit a disturbing tendency toward what can only be called irrational optimism. They consistently attempt to solve problems that are mathematically impossible, pursue goals that exceed their capabilities, and maintain hope in situations where logic clearly dictates surrender. This cognitive flaw has led them to numerous failures and setbacks that a more advanced species would have avoided entirely. Dr. Webb leaned over to whisper something to Ambassador Chun, but she held up a hand to silence him. Her eyes never left Zalara as the Colonian continued her presentation. To demonstrate this point, I have prepared a simple test, a problem that requires advanced mathematical reasoning, spatial visualization, and logical deduction. It is well within the capabilities of any properly educated member of our species, yet should prove impossible for a human mind to solve. Zalara's manipulator arms danced across a control interface, and suddenly, the air above the assembly filled with a complex, three-dimensional mathematical construct. It was beautiful in its complexity, a constantly shifting geometric pattern that seemed to fold in on itself while maintaining perfect mathematical harmony. Equations and variables floated around it like glowing satellites, their symbols shifting and changing in real time. This is what we call a nexus problem, Zalara explained with evident pride. It involves simultaneous calculation across 17 dimensions, incorporates quantum uncertainty principles, and requires intuitive leaps that can only be made by minds capable of processing information at the theoretical maximum speed. The average Colonian doctoral candidate can solve this in approximately 6 hours. A trained expert can complete it in 2. She paused dramatically, her 4 eyes scanning the assembly. I challenge any human present to even attempt this problem. Not to solve it, mind you, that would be impossible for them, but merely to demonstrate their thought process. Let us observe how a limited mind approaches an unlimited problem. The silence that followed was deafening. Every delegate in the chamber turned to look at the human section, some with curiosity, others with pity, and a few with barely concealed amusement. Ambassador Chun felt the weight of those stares, the expectations of failure heavy in the recycled air of the station. Dr. Webb started to stand, his hand already reaching for his datapad, where he had prepared several mathematical proofs that might at least demonstrate human competence. Colonel Rodriguez tensed, ready to object on diplomatic grounds. Engineer Park nervously adjusted his glasses, running calculations in his head. But Ambassador Chun stood first. I accept your challenge, Dr. Nexthes, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic system. The translation protocols instantly converted her words into the dozen languages represented in the assembly. A ripple of surprise went through the gathered delegates. Zalara's 4 eyes widened slightly. She had expected the humans to decline or perhaps attempt some diplomatic deflection. She certainly hadn't expected their lead diplomat to accept personally. Ambassador Dr. Webb whispered urgently, perhaps I should. We're not the smartest. We're not the strongest. We're not the oldest or wisest. Our brains are smaller, our lifespan shorter, our technology less advanced. She paused, looking around the chamber at the sea of alien faces, all focused intently on her. But you've made one critical error in your assessment. You've assumed that intelligence is simply about processing power, about the ability to manipulate complex mathematical relationships or perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. You've confused capability with wisdom, knowledge with understanding. Zalara's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching annoyance. Ambassador Chun, with respect, this is precisely the type of deflection I would expect from a species unable to face its limitations. The problem before you is not a matter of philosophy, but of pure logic and calculation. You're absolutely right, Chun agreed, surprising everyone. This problem requires pure logic and calculation. But before I attempt to solve it using human methods, I have a question for you, Dr. Nexthes. In all your centuries of study, in all your research into cognitive capabilities and intellectual hierarchies, have you ever stopped to ask yourself why humans are here? I beg your pardon? Why are humans part of the Galactic Council at all? If we're so intellectually inferior, if our cognitive capabilities are so limited, why did the Council vote to admit us? What possible value could we add to an organization of such advanced civilizations? Zalara opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The question was so simple, so basic, that she had never actually considered it. The admission of humans to the Council had been proposed by the Vorthack and seconded by the Synthesis Collective, with surprisingly little debate. The vote had been nearly unanimous. The council recognizes potential in all sentient species, she said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. That's the official answer, Chen acknowledged. But it doesn't explain why. What potential do we have that your far superior civilizations lack? The chamber was completely silent now. Every delegate, from the crystalline architects to the gaseous beings of pure thought, waited for Zalara's response. The council's decision-making process involves many factors beyond pure cognitive ability, Zalara said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Indeed it does, Chen said with a slight smile. So perhaps, before I attempt your impossible problem, we should consider what those factors might be. What is it about humanity that every other species in this chamber recognized as valuable enough to grant us membership in the most exclusive organization in the galaxy? She gestured to the rotating mathematical construct above her head. Your problem is beautiful, Dr. Nexthes. It's a masterpiece of mathematical elegance and logical complexity. But I suspect that's not the only way to approach it. In fact, I suspect that your people's approach to this problem, brilliant as it is, might be missing something fundamental. That's impossible, Zalara said, though her voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. The Nexus problem has been studied by the finest minds in the galaxy. Every possible approach has been explored and cataloged. Every approach available to your way of thinking, Chun corrected gently. But what if there's a way of seeing this problem that requires something other than pure intellectual capability? What if it requires something that can only come from a species with our particular limitations? The mathematical construct continued to rotate above them, its equations shifting and flowing like a living thing. Ambassador Chun stood beneath it, looking up at the impossible complexity with something that was neither fear nor awe, but something else entirely. You see, Dr. Nexthes, you made the same mistake that brilliant minds have made throughout history. You've assumed that because something is complex, the solution must be equally complex. You've assumed that because something requires great intelligence to create, it must require equal intelligence to understand. She reached up toward the holographic display, her hand passing through the insubstantial light. But sometimes, the most profound solutions come not from adding more complexity, but from finding the simple truth hidden within the complexity. Sometimes the answer isn't about being smart enough to solve the problem, but about being wise enough to see it differently. The chamber held its collective breath as Ambassador Chun stood silent for a moment, studying the rotating construct. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft but carried clearly through the acoustic systems. Tell me, Dr. Nexthes, when your people created this problem, what were they trying to accomplish? To create the ultimate test of cognitive capability, Zalara answered automatically. No, Chen said gently. That's what they achieved. But what were they trying to accomplish? What was their goal? For the first time since taking the podium, Dr. Zalara Nexthes found herself truly confused. The question seemed absurd, almost primitive in its simplicity. Yet something about it nagged at the edges of her consciousness, as if there was an answer there that she should be able to see, but somehow couldn't. And in that moment of confusion, something shifted in the dynamic of the chamber. For the first time in the presentation, the most brilliant mind in the galaxy was not the one asking the questions. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Dr. Zalara Nexthes, for the first time in her distinguished career, found herself genuinely uncertain. The question Ambassador Chan had posed seemed so fundamentally simple that answering it felt almost beneath her intellectual dignity, yet something about it resonated with an importance she couldn't quite grasp. The goal was to create a comprehensive test, Zalara said slowly, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, to establish measurable parameters for cognitive evaluation across species. But why? Chun pressed gently. Why do they need such a test? The Colonian's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep concentration among her people. To establish intellectual hierarchies. To determine which species were most suited for various tasks within galactic civilization. And before that, why do they need to establish those hierarchies? Around the chamber, delegates began to lean forward in their seats. The interrogation was unlike anything they had witnessed in the formal setting of the council. Ambassador Chen wasn't arguing with Dr. Nexthes or challenging her credentials. She was simply asking questions, each one more basic than the last. Yet somehow each answer seemed to reveal something unexpected. To ensure efficient allocation of resources, Zalara replied, though her tone suggested she was beginning to realize she was being led somewhere uncomfortable. To assign responsibilities based on capability. To maintain order in a complex galactic society. Ah, Chen said, nodding thoughtfully. So this test, this incredible display of mathematical brilliance, was ultimately created to solve a practical problem, to help different species work together more effectively. She gestured to the rotating construct above them, its equations still shifting in their hypnotic patterns. But here's what I find interesting, Dr. Nexthes. In solving that practical problem, your people created something beautiful. This isn't just a test, it's a work of art. The mathematics have an elegance that goes far beyond their functional purpose. Someone, somewhere in your long history, cared enough about this problem to make the solution beautiful. Dr. Webb watched from the human section with growing amazement. He had known Ambassador Chun for 15 years, had worked with her on the complex negotiations that led to Earth's admission to the Council. He knew she had no formal training in advanced mathematics or quantum theory. Yet somehow, she was taking the conversation in directions that even he, with his multiple physics degrees, would never have considered. Zalara's expression was becoming increasingly troubled. Beauty is a subjective concept, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The mathematics are elegant because efficient solutions tend toward elegance. It's a natural property of logical systems. Is it, Chen asked, or is it because the beings who created this problem understood something fundamental about the nature of intelligence itself? She began to walk slowly around the base of the holographic display, her simple black shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Every delegate in the chamber tracked her movement, as if she were the center of gravity in their artificial world. You see, Dr. Nexthes, I've spent the last 30 years of my life studying not mathematics or physics, but something your people consider far less important, human behavior. I've watched how we approach problems, how we fail, how we succeed, and, most importantly, how we think about thinking itself. She stopped directly beneath the center of the rotating construct, looking up at its impossible complexity. And what I've learned is that humans have a peculiar trait. When we encounter something we don't understand, our first instinct isn't to apply more intelligence. It's to ask why it exists in the first place. Colonel Rodriguez felt her heart racing as she watched the exchange. She had served in 3 interstellar conflicts and faced down alien battle fleets without flinching. But watching Ambassador Chen calmly dissect the assumptions of the galaxy's greatest intellect was somehow more terrifying than any combat she had experienced. Every human child goes through a phase where their favorite question is why, Chen continued. Why is the sky blue? Why do we have to eat? Why can't we fly? And if you answer their question, they immediately ask why again. Why is blue light scattered differently? Why do our bodies need fuel? Why don't humans have wings? She smiled, and for the first time since taking the podium, she looked directly at the human delegation. We call it the infinite why. Most of us grow out of it as we mature, but we never entirely lose it. It's always there, lurking in the back of our minds, ready to emerge when we encounter something truly puzzling. This is all very interesting, Zalara said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. However, philosophy cannot solve mathematical problems. The nexus problem requires precise calculation and logical deduction, not speculation about human childhood development. Does it? Chen asked, turning back to face the Colonian. Are you certain about that? Of course I'm certain. I created this problem myself, along with a team of the finest mathematical minds in the galaxy. Every aspect has been carefully designed to test specific cognitive functions. And I'm sure you're right about how it tests those functions, Chen agreed. But I wonder if you're right about what it's actually testing for. She gestured to the equations floating around them. You see, when I look at this problem, I don't see a test of intelligence. I see something much more interesting. I see a question that someone cared enough about to spend enormous amounts of time and energy making beautiful. Engineer Park found himself holding his breath as he watched the exchange. His background in systems design had taught him to look for patterns and relationships and He was beginning to see something in Ambassador Chen's approach that reminded him of his own work. She wasn't trying to solve the problem in the traditional sense. She was trying to understand what the problem itself was trying to accomplish. "Consider this," Chen said, beginning to pace again. "Your people spent centuries developing this test. Centuries of your finest minds working together to create something that would challenge even their own capabilities. Why would they do that?" "To advance the boundaries of knowledge," Zalara replied automatically. "But advancing knowledge is not the same as testing it," Chun pointed out. "If they wanted to advance the boundaries of mathematical knowledge, they would have worked on unsolved proofs or unexplored theorems. This isn't advancement. This is measurement. They already knew the mathematics involved. They were testing something else entirely." The Colonians' primary arms began to gesture in patterns that those familiar with their species recognized as signs of deep agitation. "You're overthinking this, Ambassador. Sometimes a mathematical problem is simply a mathematical problem." "Is it?" Chen asked. "Then why is it beautiful?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the chamber, delegates from dozens of different species found themselves considering it seriously. The Nexus problem was indeed beautiful. Even those without the mathematical background to understand its complexity could appreciate the elegant way the equations flowed and interacted. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "why is it impossible?" "I beg your pardon? You said yourself that this problem pushes the boundaries of what even Colonian minds can accomplish. It requires the absolute maximum of cognitive capability. But why create a test that's so difficult? If you wanted to measure intelligence, wouldn't it be more useful to create a range of problems with different difficulty levels?" Dr. Nexthes opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The human was right. It would have been more scientifically sound to create a battery of tests ranging from simple to complex. The Nexus problem was an outlier, a single challenge that pushed cognitive abilities to their absolute limits. "Unless," Chin said softly, "the difficulty isn't a flaw in the test design. Unless the impossibility is the point." She stopped pacing and looked directly at Zalara. What if this problem wasn't created to measure intelligence at all? What if it was created to measure something else entirely? The chamber was dead silent. Even the soft humming of the life support systems seemed muted as every being present focused on the human ambassador standing beneath the rotating mathematical construct. "What if," Chung continued, "this problem was designed to test not how smart someone is, but how they respond when they encounter something that exceeds their capabilities? What if it's not testing intelligence, but character?" Dr. Okafor felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized what Ambassador Chen was doing. As a specialist in xenocultural relations, she understood better than most how different species approach challenges. She had seen the same pattern in her research, the tendency for advanced civilizations to become so focused on their own capabilities that they forgot to question why those capabilities existed in the first place. "That's ridiculous," Zalara said, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. "Character is not quantifiable. It cannot be measured through mathematical problems." "Can't it?" Chen asked. "When you encounter something impossible, how do you respond? Do you give up? Do you apply more of the same approach that already failed? Do you blame the problem for being unfair? Or do you step back and ask yourself if maybe you're approaching it wrong?" She looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. Every species here has encountered the impossible at some point in their development. How they responded to it shaped who they became as a civilization. The Colonians encountered the limits of organic intelligence and developed methods to enhance their cognitive abilities. The Synthoids encountered the limitations of biological existence and transcended them through technology. The Vorthak encountered the isolation of individual consciousness and learned to think collectively. But you, Dr. Nexthes, you created a problem that can't be solved by any of those approaches. It can't be solved by more intelligence, by better technology, or by collective thinking. You created something that forces whoever encounters it to find an entirely new way of seeing. Zalara's 4 eyes were now focused intently on the human ambassador. Despite herself, despite her centuries of intellectual training, she found herself genuinely curious about where this line of reasoning was leading. "And what new way of seeing do you propose, Ambassador Chun?" Chun smiled, and for the first time since taking the podium, she looked relaxed. I propose we stop trying to solve the problem and start trying to understand what it's really asking us. Ambassador Chun stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the floating mathematics of the Nexus problem. The equations pulsed and shifted around her like living things, their complexity almost overwhelming in the silence that had fallen over the assembly. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath of the carefully filtered air. When she opened them again, something had changed in her expression. The diplomatic mask she had worn for decades had fallen away, replaced by something more fundamental. She looked like someone who had just remembered something important that she had forgotten long ago. "Dr. Nexthes," she said quietly, "may I tell you a story?" The Colonian's 4 eyes blinked in sequence again. "I fail to see how storytelling is relevant to mathematical problem-solving." "Please," Chin said simply. "Just one story. If it doesn't help solve your problem, I'll admit defeat, and we can return to the regularly scheduled proceedings." Zalara hesitated. Every instinct she had told her to refuse, to insist on proper mathematical approaches to mathematical problems. But something about the human's calm certainty made her curious despite herself. "Very well," she said finally. "One story." Chin nodded and began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the holographic display. As she moved, her voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems, reaching every delegate regardless of their species or sensory configuration. 50 years ago, she began, before humans had even achieved reliable interstellar travel, there was a young girl named Maria Santos living in a small town in Brazil. Maria was not particularly intelligent by any measurable standard. She struggled with basic mathematics, barely graduated from high school, and worked in a factory that manufactured simple electronics. The delegates stirred restlessly. Several looked confused about why they were being told about an apparently unremarkable human from the pre-contact era. One day, Maria's daughter became very sick. The doctors at the local hospital said she needed a specific type of medicine that was only available in the capital city, over 1,000 kilometers away. Maria had no money for airplane tickets, no car, and no way to make the journey. Chun paused beside a section of the display where the equations seemed to form particularly elegant spirals. Now, any rational person would have accepted that the situation was impossible. The medicine was too far away, the journey too expensive, the obstacles too great. A more advanced civilization might have analyzed the problem systematically, identifying each barrier and developing technological solutions to overcome them. But Maria did something different. She walked outside her house, looked up at the sky, and said to herself, "My daughter needs that medicine, so somehow I'm going to get it." Dr. Webb found himself leaning forward in his seat. He had known Ambassador Chun long enough to recognize when she was building towards something important, but he couldn't see where this particular story was leading. Over the next 3 days, Chun continued, Maria did things that made no logical sense. She called people she hadn't spoken to in years. She asked for help from strangers. She made promises she had no way of keeping. She organized a community fundraiser for a cause no one had heard of. She convinced her supervisor to give her emergency leave from a job that never gave emergency leave. And somehow, piece by piece, a solution emerged. A cousin she barely knew offered to drive part of the way. A stranger at the fundraiser turned out to work for an airline and helped arrange a discount ticket. The local priest had connections with a hospital in the capital. A Dr. Maria had never met agreed to expedite the prescription process. Chun stopped walking and looked directly at Dr. Nexthes. Maria got the medicine. Her daughter recovered completely. And if you asked any of the people who helped her to explain exactly how it happened, none of them could give you a logical account. The solution existed not because any individual was capable of solving the problem, but because Maria refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. The chamber was completely silent. Even the soft hum of the life support systems seemed to fade as every being present considered the implications of what they had just heard. "That's a very touching story," Zalara said finally, though her voice lacked its earlier dismissiveness. "But I still don't see how it relates to the Nexus problem." "Don't you?" Chen asked gently. Maria faced a problem that was impossible for her to solve using her available resources and capabilities. But instead of accepting that impossibility, she did something that only humans seem to do consistently. She changed the nature of the problem itself. She gestured to the rotating mathematical construct above them. You created this problem to test cognitive limits. But what if the real test isn't about reaching those limits? What if it's about what happens when you realize the limits aren't really there? Colonel Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand what Ambassador Chen was suggesting. In her military career, she had encountered impossible tactical situations dozens of times. The solution was never to be smarter or stronger than the enemy. The solution was to find a way to make the impossible irrelevant. You see, Chun continued, humans have a peculiar relationship with impossibility. When other species encounter something they can't do, they tend to accept it as a fundamental limit of reality. But when humans encounter the impossible, our first instinct is to assume we're asking the wrong question. She reached up toward the floating equations, her hand passing through the insubstantial light. So let me ask you a different question, DR. Next these. Not whether this problem can be solved, but whether it needs to be solved at all. I don't understand, Zalara said, though her tone suggested she was beginning to. What is the actual purpose of this problem? Chen asked. Not the stated purpose, not the theoretical purpose, but the real reason it exists. To test cognitive capabilities. Why? To establish intellectual hierarchies. Why? To allocate responsibilities efficiently. Why? Zalara's four eyes narrowed. She was beginning to see the pattern, the endless regression of questions that the human had warned about. But, somehow, she found herself unable to resist answering. To maintain order in galactic civilization. Why? To ensure the survival and prosperity of all member species. And there it is, Chen said softly. The real purpose. Everything else, the mathematics, the testing, the hierarchies, they're all tools serving that one fundamental goal. The survival and prosperity of all member species. She began walking again, but now her movements seemed purposeful, as if she was building toward something. So tell me, DR, next these, in service of that goal, what does your test actually accomplish? It identifies the species best suited for intellectual leadership. Does it? Or does it identify the species most skilled at solving the types of problems that Colonians consider important? The question hit like a physical blow. Zalara actually took a step backward, her 6 arms moving in agitated patterns. That's not. The principles of logic and mathematics are universal. They don't favor any particular species' perspective. Are they? Chen asked. Are they really universal? Or are they universal within the framework of how Colonians think about the universe? She stopped walking and faced the assembly. Every species here has encountered challenges that nearly destroyed them. The Colonians faced the limits of organic intelligence. The Synthoids faced biological mortality. The Vorthack faced individual isolation. But humans? Humans face something different. We faced our own tendency to give up when things got hard. Dr. Park felt his breath catch. As an engineer, he had always admired the elegant solutions that other species brought to technical problems. But he was beginning to realize that there was something unique about the human approach to engineering challenges, the willingness to try things that shouldn't work, to iterate through failure after failure until something unexpected emerged. Our entire development as a species, Chun continued, has been shaped by encounters with impossibility. We couldn't fly, so we invented airplanes. We couldn't survive in space, so we built spacecraft. We couldn't communicate across vast distances, so we developed technologies that your people consider primitive, but that somehow work anyway. But that's exactly what I mean, Zalara protested, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Humans consistently attempt things that are beyond their capabilities. It's inefficient and often dangerous. Is it? Chen asked. Or is it the most efficient approach possible for a species that refuses to accept limits as final? She gestured to the human delegation. Dr. Webb over there has no business understanding quantum mechanics. His brain is too small, his lifespan too short, his sensory apparatus too limited. Yet somehow, he contributed to the theoretical framework that made faster-than-light communication possible. Colonel Rodriguez has no business developing tactics that can outmaneuver species with superior technology and longer strategic planning horizons. Yet somehow, her approaches have been studied and adopted by military academies across the galaxy. Engineer Park has no business designing systems that work alongside technologies from dozens of different species with completely different engineering philosophies. Yet somehow, the hybrid systems he creates are more robust and adaptable than anything any single species has produced alone. Dr. Okafor felt tears streaming down her face as she listened. She had spent her entire career studying the ways different species interacted, trying to find common ground between radically different ways of seeing the universe. She had always felt like her work was somehow less important than the grand achievements of physics and engineering. But now she was beginning to understand that her specialty, helping impossible differences somehow coexist, might be the most important skill of all. And Dr. Okafor, Chun continued, has no business understanding alien psychology well enough to facilitate meaningful communication between species that evolved on completely different worlds with completely different sensory experiences and cognitive structures. Yet somehow, she finds ways to build bridges between minds that should be incomprehensible to each other. Chun turned back to face Dr. Nexthes. So here's my question, Dr. Nexthes. You've spent centuries developing tests to measure intelligence. But have you ever developed a test to measure the ability to make the impossible possible? The silence that followed was unlike anything the Galactic Council chamber had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something too profound for words. Every delegate, regardless of their species or background, found themselves confronting questions they had never thought to ask. Finally, Dr. Zalara Nexthes spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How would such a test even be possible? Ambassador Chun smiled, and for the first time since beginning her presentation, she looked directly up at the Nexus problem rotating above their heads. I think you already created it, she said softly. You just didn't realize what you were testing for. The mathematical construct continued its slow rotation above the assembly, its equations shimmering in the artificial light of the chamber. But now somehow it looked different. The same complexity was there, the same elegant mathematical relationships. But viewed through the lens of Ambassador Chen's questions, it had taken on an entirely new significance. Dr. Zalara Nexthes stared up at her creation with four eyes that held a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. For the first time in her distinguished career, she was seeing her own work from an angle she had never considered. I don't understand what you're suggesting, she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had carried throughout her presentation. This is a mathematical problem. It has specific parameters, defined variables, measurable outcomes. How could it be testing something other than cognitive capability? Ambassador Chen looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates, then back at the rotating display above them. May I approach the problem directly? She asked. You may try, Zalara replied, though her tone suggested she expected failure. Though I should warn you that simply stating your approach won't constitute a solution. The problem requires actual mathematical manipulation. Chen nodded and moved to the control interface that Zalara had been using to manipulate the display. The controls were designed for Colonian hands, but the human ambassador managed to adapt to their configuration after a few moments of experimentation. First, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, let me make something absolutely clear. I cannot solve this problem using the methods that Dr. Nexthes intended. My mathematical training is insufficient, my cognitive processing speed inadequate, and my understanding of 17-dimensional mathematics essentially non-existent. A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembly. Several delegates looked at each other uncertainly, wondering why the human was essentially admitting defeat before even beginning. However, Chun continued, I think there might be another way to approach it. Not by solving the mathematics, but by understanding why the mathematics exist in the first place. She manipulated the controls, and the display began to shift. The complex equations remained the same, but their arrangement began to change. Instead of floating randomly around the central construct, they began to organize themselves into patterns. Dr. Webb leaned forward in his seat, his scientific curiosity overriding his diplomatic caution. What Ambassador Chun was doing wasn't mathematical manipulation in any traditional sense. She was reorganizing the visual presentation of the problem without changing its fundamental mathematical content. You see, Chen said as she worked, When I look at this problem, I don't see a test of intelligence. I see a question about collaboration. Collaboration? Zalara asked, her four eyes tracking the changes being made to her carefully designed display. Look at the structure, Chen replied, highlighting different sections of the mathematical construct as she spoke. This section here requires understanding of quantum uncertainty principles, something the synthoids have mastered better than any other species. This part involves collective processing of information across multiple dimensional frameworks, clearly derived from Vorthack research. These calculations here use mathematical techniques that were pioneered by the Luminous Collective. As she spoke, different sections of the display began to glow with different colors, each one corresponding to mathematical approaches developed by different species. And here, she continued, indicating a section near the core of the construct, we have computational processes that are clearly based on Colonian advances in cognitive enhancement. Engineer Park felt his pulse quickening as he began to see the pattern Chun was revealing. As someone who specialized in hybrid systems design, he recognized the approach she was taking. She wasn't trying to solve the problem as a single integrated challenge. She was breaking it down into components that matched the strengths of different species. This is interesting as a historical analysis, Zalara said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty, but it doesn't constitute a solution. The problem must be solved as an integrated whole, not as separate components. Must it? Chen asked. Says who? The mathematical structure itself requires integrated processing. You can't solve parts of it independently and then combine the results. The relationships between the different sections are what make it a complete problem. You're absolutely right, Chen agreed. Which brings me to the most interesting part of your creation, Dr. Nexthes. This section here. She highlighted a small, but crucial part of the mathematical construct, a series of equations that seem to serve as connection points between the larger sections. These aren't mathematical calculations at all, she said softly. They're communication protocols. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. Dr. Nexthes stared at the highlighted section, her four eyes moving in patterns that indicated intense concentration. That's impossible, she whispered. Those are standard mathematical operators. They're part of the problem structure. Are they? Chen asked. Or are they instructions for how different types of mathematical thinking can be combined and integrated? She manipulated the display further, and suddenly, the structure of the problem became clear in a way that no one in the chamber had ever seen before. The complex mathematical sections weren't just related to each other. They were designed to be solved by different types of minds working together. Colonel Rodriguez found herself standing without realizing it. Her military experience had taught her to recognize strategic frameworks when she saw them, and what Ambassador Chun was revealing looked remarkably like a battle plan designed for an alliance of forces with different capabilities and specializations. This isn't a test of intelligence, Chen said, her voice filled with wonder as she continued to manipulate the display. It's a test of cooperation. You've created a problem that can only be solved if multiple species work together, each contributing their unique cognitive strengths. But that's not possible, Zalara protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I created this problem myself. I would have known if I was designing a cooperation test. Would you? Chen asked gently. Or is it possible that when you set out to create the ultimate test of cognitive capability, you unconsciously created something that reflected the ultimate cognitive capability, the ability of different minds to work together toward a common goal? Dr. Okafor was now openly weeping as she watched the exchange. Her entire career had been dedicated to facilitating communication and cooperation between species with radically different ways of thinking. To see that same principle embedded in what had appeared to be a purely mathematical challenge was overwhelming in its implications. Look at the structure more carefully, Chun continued, her hands moving confidently over the alien controls. Each section requires not just the mathematical techniques of different species, but the actual thought processes that led to those techniques. The quantum uncertainty calculations don't just use synthoid mathematics. They require the synthoid understanding of probability as a fundamental aspect of reality. She highlighted another section. The collective processing components don't just use Vorthack methods. They require the Vorthack conception of individual consciousness as part of a larger whole. And another. The multidimensional analysis doesn't just use Colonian cognitive enhancement techniques. It requires the Colonian philosophical framework that sees intelligence as something that can be deliberately improved and expanded. As she worked, the true structure of the Nexus problem began to emerge. What had appeared to be a single, impossibly complex mathematical challenge was revealed to be something far more sophisticated, a framework for combining different types of intelligence in ways that none of them could achieve alone. But how is this possible? Zalara asked, her voice filled with confusion and something approaching awe. How could I have created something like this without knowing it? Ambassador Chen stopped manipulating the display and turned to face the Colonian directly. Because, she said softly, you didn't create it alone. What do you mean? Think about it. Where did the mathematical techniques in this problem come from? Did you invent them all yourself? Of course not. I drew upon the accumulated mathematical knowledge of galactic civilization. The quantum principles came from synthoid research, the collective processing methods from Vortex studies, the multidimensional analysis from the collaborative work of dozens of species over thousands of years. Chun finished. You created this problem by combining the best insights from every major civilization in the galaxy. She gestured to the assembled delegates. Every being in this chamber contributed something to the knowledge base you used to create the Nexus problem. In a very real sense, they all helped create it. And now, perhaps, they can all help solve it. The implications were staggering. Dr. Nexthes had intended to create a test that would demonstrate Colonian intellectual superiority. Instead, she had created something that could only be fully understood and solved through the combined efforts of multiple species working together. This is why humans are here, Chun said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent chamber. Not because we're the smartest or the strongest or the most advanced, but because we refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. We keep asking why until we find a way to change the nature of the problem itself. She looked around at the assembled delegates. And sometimes, changing the nature of the problem means realizing it was never meant to be solved alone. The mathematical construct continued to rotate above them, but now its meaning had been completely transformed. What had begun as a demonstration of intellectual hierarchy had become a blueprint for galactic cooperation. Dr. Zalara Nexthes stood silent for a long moment, staring up at her creation as if seeing it for the first time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. How do we solve it? Ambassador Chun smiled. Together, she said simply. We solve it together. What followed was unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever witnessed. As Ambassador Chen's words settled over the assembly, something fundamental shifted in the chamber's atmosphere. The competitive tension that had dominated the session began to dissolve, replaced by something that could only be described as collaborative excitement. Dr. Zalara Nexthes stood motionless for nearly a full minute, her four eyes fixed on the rotating mathematical construct above them. The silence stretched until several delegates began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then, slowly, the Colonian began to laugh. It started as a small sound, barely audible even in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. But it grew steadily, becoming a rich, harmonious tone that resonated through the crystalline structure of the station itself. Other species recognized it as the Colonian expression of profound intellectual joy, the sound they made when encountering a truth so beautiful and unexpected that it transcended mere understanding. Incredible, Zalara whispered, her laughter subsiding into wonder. Absolutely incredible. For 3 centuries, I've been solving the wrong problem. She moved to the control interface, her 6 arms dancing across the displays with newfound purpose. Ambassador Chun, with your permission, I'd like to test your hypothesis. If this problem truly requires a collaborative solution, then we should be able to demonstrate it empirically. Please, Chun said, stepping aside to give the Colonian access to the controls. What happened next would be studied by xenopsychologists and mathematical philosophers for generations to come. Dr. Nexthes began by isolating different sections of the Nexus problem, displaying them separately for the assembled delegates. As each section appeared, she called upon the species whose mathematical traditions had contributed to its development. Honored representatives of the Synthoid Collective, she said, her voice carrying a new note of respect. Would you be willing to examine this quantum uncertainty matrix? I believe it draws heavily upon your people's foundational work in probability-based reality modeling. The Synthoid delegation, three beings whose crystalline forms pulsed with internal light, moved forward with mechanical precision. Their leader, an entity designation SC-7749, interfaced directly with the display through quantum-entangled data streams. The structure is elegant, SC-7749 reported, its voice a harmony of electronic tones. However, the uncertainty parameters are configured in a way that requires external stabilization. The quantum states can only be resolved if they are influenced by deterministic calculations from another framework. Exactly as it should be, Dr. Nexthes said, her excitement building. The section cannot be solved in isolation. It requires input from related calculations. Colonel Rodriguez watched in fascination as the process continued. Her military background had taught her to appreciate coordinated operations, but this was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Instead of different units following a single battle plan, this was like watching multiple armies spontaneously discover that their separate missions were actually part of a larger campaign. The Vorthak delegation was called upon next. These beings, tall, ethereal creatures whose individual consciousness existed as part of a larger collective mind, examined the multidimensional processing components of the problem. Their representative, who spoke for the collective consciousness of their entire species, provided insight into the distributed calculation requirements. The processing matrices are designed for parallel consciousness integration, the Vorthak speaker reported. However, the individual nodes require discrete input from separate cognitive frameworks. The collective can process the relationships, but the base calculations must originate from individual perspectives. Engineer Park found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed by what he was witnessing. As someone who specialized in designing systems that integrated technologies from multiple species, he recognized the pattern that was emerging. Each component of the Nexus problem was designed to interface with others, but none of them could function independently. The Luminous Collective, beings of pure energy who communicated through manipulation of electromagnetic spectra, analyzed the mathematical poetry embedded within the problem structure. The Architects, crystalline entities who thought in terms of physical space and geometric relationships, examined the spatial frameworks that held the mathematical components together. The Elder Council of Proxima, ancient beings whose long lifespans allowed them to perceive patterns across millennia, provided temporal context for the problem's evolutionary structure. With each contribution, the true nature of the Nexus problem became clearer. It wasn't just that it required different species to solve different parts. It actually required different ways of thinking about reality itself. The Synthoid focus on probability and uncertainty, the Vorthak understanding of collective consciousness, the Colonian enhancement of individual intelligence, the human refusal to accept impossibility, all of these perspectives were essential elements of the solution. Dr. Webb stood up suddenly, his scientific excitement overriding diplomatic protocol. "Dr. Nexthes," he called out. "May I suggest something?" "Please," Zalara replied, her own protocols apparently forgotten in the face of the collaborative breakthrough they were witnessing. "What if the problem isn't just designed to require collaboration?" Webb said, moving down from the human section toward the central display. "What if it's actually a model of collaboration itself?" He gestured to the rotating construct. "Look at the structure. Each mathematical component contributes something unique, but the real complexity comes from the relationships between them. It's not just a problem that requires cooperation to solve. It's a mathematical description of what cooperation looks like when different types of intelligence work together." Dr. Okafor gasped as the implications hit her. "It's a blueprint," she whispered. "It's not testing our ability to cooperate. It's showing us how cooperation works at the deepest mathematical level." The realization swept through the chamber like a wave. Delegates from dozens of different worlds found themselves looking at the Nexus problem with entirely new eyes. What they had thought was a challenge to be overcome was actually a gift, a mathematical framework for understanding how different forms of intelligence could be combined to achieve things none of them could accomplish alone. Ambassador Chun stood quietly to one side, watching as the representatives of galactic civilization discovered something that humans had always known instinctively. that the whole could be greater than the sum of its parts, but only if the parts were willing to work together rather than compete with each other. The actual solution of the Nexus problem took another 6 hours. But it wasn't solved in the way that Dr. Nexthes had originally intended. Instead of a single brilliant mind working through complex calculations, it was solved by dozens of minds working together, each contributing their unique perspective to a challenge that required all of them. The synthoids calculated the quantum probability matrices. The Vorthack processed the multidimensional relationships. The Colonians enhanced the cognitive frameworks. The Luminous Collective provided the mathematical poetry that held it all together. The architects created the spatial structure that gave the solution physical meaning. The Elder Council provided the temporal context that made the solution stable across time. And the humans? The humans asked the questions that kept everyone focused on why they were solving the problem in the first place. When the solution finally emerged, it was unlike anything any of them had expected. Instead of a single answer, it was a dynamic framework, a set of mathematical relationships that could be applied to challenges facing galactic civilization. It was a way of thinking about problems that made use of every species' cognitive strengths while compensating for their individual limitations. As the session finally drew to a close, Dr. Zalara Nexthes approached Ambassador Chun with an expression of profound humility. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When I began this presentation, I intended to demonstrate human intellectual inferiority. Instead, I've learned something far more valuable about the nature of intelligence itself." Chun smiled and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting and friendship. "Dr. Nexthes, you created something beautiful today. Not because you meant to, but because you had the courage to look at your own work through new eyes when someone suggested a different perspective." "But I was wrong about humans," Zalara protested. "Wrong about intelligence itself." "Were you?" Chun asked. "Or were you just asking the wrong questions?" The Colonian's 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she considered this. "You've done it again," she said finally. "Made me question my own assumptions with a simple question." "It's what we do," Chun replied with a gentle laugh. "Sometimes it's the only thing we're really good at." The formal session ended, but the real work was just beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, the solution to the Nexus problem would be refined and developed into practical applications. Trade disputes that had seemed intractable would be resolved using frameworks that allowed different species to contribute their unique perspectives. Scientific research would be revolutionized by collaboration protocols that made use of each civilization's cognitive strengths. Military alliances would be restructured around the principle that different ways of thinking about strategy could be combined for maximum effectiveness. But, perhaps most importantly, the relationship between the species of the Galactic Council would be forever changed. The idea that some civilizations were inherently superior to others gave way to a new understanding. That each species brought something unique and valuable to the galactic community, and that the real measure of intelligence wasn't the ability to solve problems alone, but the wisdom to know when working together would achieve better results. Years later, Dr. Zalara Nexthes would write in her memoirs, "I set out to prove that humans were intellectually inferior to the rest of galactic civilization. Instead, I discovered that they possessed something far more valuable than raw intelligence, the ability to help others see their own potential." In challenging me to question my assumptions, Ambassador Chun didn't just solve the Nexus problem. She solved the problem of galactic cooperation itself. And in the margins of that memoir, in handwriting that belonged to Ambassador Sarah Chun, someone had added a simple note: "Sometimes the most important questions are the ones we're afraid to ask." The legend of the human who dared challenge the impossible, and in doing so made it possible for everyone, would spread throughout the galaxy. It would be told in the crystalline song histories of the Luminous Collective, encoded in the quantum memory banks of the synthoids, and whispered across the collective consciousness of the Vorthack. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the humans themselves, who simply added it to their long collection of stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they refused to accept that something couldn't be done. After all, that's what humans did best. They asked why something was impossible, and then they found a way to make it possible anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was exactly what the galaxy needed.